Welcome everybody to our web chat with Neil Gray, Swift Senior Manager for Corporate Solutions in EMEA. And in this session, we're going to be discussing the progress of their Swift services for corporates. We're going to be discussing three areas: the take-up of Swift, the global take-up, and then Swift's latest initiatives for corporates. And in the take-up of Swift by corporates, we're going to be discussing three areas: number of corporates, the profile, and how they're choosing to connect. In terms of the number of corporates, what are the numbers these days?
Well, we finished last year, so we finished 2014 at just over 1,400 corporates. And that's
are that individual corporates or sites?
It's actually, we measure corporates by number of registered corporate entities. And your question is a good one, because of course many corporates are complex organizations. They have multiple legal entities. But what we typically see is that many corporates have centralized their treasury or payables and receivables function into some sort of global centralized global operation, or maybe they've set up a shared service center. And usually they register a single entity that serves the wider group. So it's 1,400 corporate entities. But if you actually look at the number of separate subsidiaries that may be serviced by those 1,400, we estimate that it's something like 35,000 corporate entities being served.
That makes more sense, yes. And in terms of the global take-up, the profile of the corporates, what type of corporates are joining? Because it used to just be the very large multinationals.
Absolutely. So when the proposition was first launched onto the market, it was very much the large multinationals that were the first to take up the solution. So you had the GEs, the Microsofts, the ArcelorMittals of this world. These were the typical types of corporates that were joining Swift. They were the ones that typically had the biggest challenge. They had the most banking relationships and the most complexity in terms of their treasury and payables and receivables functions. What we see today is a slightly different picture. We still see these large multinationals continuing to join, but what we're seeing in parallel is more of the mid-tier market availing themselves of what Swift has to offer. So in fact, if you look at the typical profile of corporates that we have on Swift today, for example, if you were to look at them by annual turnover as one measure, yes, it's true that we still have something like 60% of the corporates on Swift fitting into that large multinational category. You know, typically more than $1 billion, or in some cases more than $10 billion in annual turnover. But what's interesting is that now some 40% of the corporates that we have on Swift are what I would classify in the mid-tier. You know, they're typically 300, 400, 500 million to $1 billion.
But how small do they get? I mean, does it go down to somebody with 100 million, 50 million?
Of course, you can't really generalize, but I would say it's typically the sort of 300, 400, 500 million to $1 billion. You know, we're not quite at the corner shop yet, but it's typically, if you look at the UK.
You'll never be in the corner shop.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the UK, it's typically the FTSE 250, you know, going beyond, say, the FTSE 100 and into the FTSE 250. You know, that's kind of where we're increasingly playing these days. What's also
okay, and in terms of how they're choosing to connect, are there any major changes there?
I think maybe before looking at choosing to connect, there's one thing I wanted to maybe share on the profile as well. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that a large part of the proposition that Swift offers to corporates is providing this single standardized channel to multiple banks. And of course, that does kind of suggest that if you're a corporate that is working with very many banks, then you're going to get the most value from that channel rationalization. But interestingly, we've done a little bit of an analysis on, you know, typically how many banks corporates are using Swift to connect into. And actually the figures are quite surprising. Sure, we do have, you know, those large multinationals that we spoke about that maybe have 50, 100 or even more banking relationships using Swift for that. But more and more we're seeing corporates more in the mid-tier that are connecting using SWIFT maybe to only up to a maximum of 5, or in some cases a maximum of 10 banks. And I think that might surprise people. You know, sometimes
it surprises me, but it simplifies your life, then it's just worth it.
That's right, because you don't need to have, you know, dozens and dozens of banks for the proposition to make sense. Even if you're only working with maybe 5 or 10 banks, you know, it's still a number of different channels, often a number of different file formats and payment formats that you need to support with those different banks, different logins, different systems, different ways of connecting those channels into your back office systems. So even when the number of banking relationships isn't as many as those largest of players, it can still be worth looking at SWIFT and getting some efficiencies from it.
Interesting. And how are they choosing to connect? Is it all via Lines Like 2 now?
Well, again, we've seen some changes recently. If you look at if you would have looked at the picture five or more years ago, it was a very different picture. You would have had pretty much every new joiner, and that's corporates, but also financial institutions as well, increasingly kind of joining via the service bureau model. It was almost a given to choose the service bureau model, and the question was more about which bureau do you choose, and obviously there are a number of different players in the market. The picture today is very, very different. If you look at across the entire corporate piece and the connectivity models that they're all using, about 10% are still connected via an in-house solution, so running a dedicated SWIFT interface in-house for that particular corporate and that corporate alone. And then the remaining 90% is split pretty much evenly between the service bureau model and Alliance Like 2. But actually that split doesn't tell the whole story, because of course Alliance Like 2 has only been around a number of years. I think it was launched in September 2012. So it's kind of, you know, just over two years on the market. And if you actually look more closely at, you know, those corporates that joined last year, it's a very interesting picture. Close to 70% of all the new corporates that joined in 2014 chose to connect via Alliance Like 2. So
in that number, do you include the ones who've got a treasury management system that are going through the treasury management supplier to SWIFT?
Yes, I mean, at SWIFT, we kind of regard connectivity as coming in. There are three options, coming in three options. There's the in-house model, where the corporate runs their own in-house SWIFT infrastructure. There's the service bureau model, where effectively the SWIFT infrastructure is outsourced to a third party, typically a technology or a solution provider. And then there's the third model, which is to use this latest cloud-based way of connecting Alliance Like 2 that's provided directly by SWIFT. But you're right, Jack, that there are a number of nuances to those models. And in particular, what we've done recently with Alliance Like 2, being a cloud-based solution, what we've done is we have teamed up with a number of leading cloud-based solution providers in the market. Perhaps, you know, these are treasury management system providers that are offering their solution on a hosted sort of cloud-based model, or maybe they are our partners that have a payments hub, again, hosted in the cloud and accessible through the internet.
Oh, okay. So if we then look at in terms of the SWIFT take-up geographically, how's it split? If we look at it three ways, the regional split, the trends emerging, and how you're responding organisationally. The regional split, is it all in Europe? Where is it?
Yeah, so I mentioned, you know, to date, or as at the end of 2014, we ended up with just over 1,400 corporates. And if you look at where those corporate entities are located, it's quite interesting. About, well, 69% of those are in EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. 21% is in North America, and the remaining 10% is in Asia. So it does rather suggest that the model is especially popular in EMEA, or in particular Europe. But that doesn't tell the whole story, because firstly, as I mentioned earlier on, corporates tend to register a central treasury function.
Oh, right. So they could be in Asia or South Latin America and actually being registered in the UK or
Correct.
the US and so on.
Correct. So, for example, I spend a lot of my time focused on the UK. And you know, an example is one of my customers is a Japanese technology company, a Japanese electronics company, you know, a very well-known brand in the market. But their global treasury function is based in the UK. So they joined SWIFT, and they've actually registered a GB entity, a UK entity on SWIFT, and they contribute to our EMEA stacks. Similarly,
so are there trends emerging from this? I mean, are we getting more and more people doing it centrally? What's happening? What are the trends?
SWIFT, I would say, very much plays into the hands of a corporate that has centralized their treasury and finance function. When putting in a payments factory or a centralized treasury operation or a shared service center, typically the next question is, okay, how am I going to link those systems into the banks? Typically what these corporates are doing is trying to bring efficiency into their treasury functions. They're often implementing sophisticated treasury management systems and or ERP systems, SAP, Oracle and the like. So they have these sophisticated back office systems that need to be connected to their banking partners, you know, for various purposes, for sending out payment instructions, either individual treasury type payments or maybe files of bulk payments.
So where are they going to be located?
So typically when these corporates are setting up a location for these centralized functions, they very often choose a location in Europe. And, you know, it's probably no surprise that you'll hear that corporates have set up in Switzerland or in Luxembourg or in Belgium. Ireland was a very popular location. The UK remains very, very popular. So what we actually see when you look at the corporates on SWIFT today is that something like 80% of the corporates that we have are very much concentrated in the US, Canada, and Europe. And even when you look at Europe, we see sort of very dominant countries. So you see the sort of UK, you see France, you see Germany, you see Switzerland, Spain.
So how are you responding to this organisationally, you SWIFT?
So, I mean, what we are, of course, trying to do is to face off to the market in the most efficient way. So from a product and proposition point of view, we have a global team. So we have a team, it's actually headquartered in Brussels, which is where SWIFT itself is headquartered, that sort of looks after the proposition itself and the strategic direction that we want to take in the corporate space. But then what we then do is we supplement that sort of global function with regional functions. And as you explained at the beginning, I'm part of an EMEA-wide team. So we have teams that focus on Europe, Middle East, and Africa as a region. We have a similar team in the Asia-Pacific region, and then a third team in the North Americas. So
one in Asia-Pacific is quite new, isn't it? What's the size of that already? How many people would be there?
You're right. It's what we've done recently is build up that business, and I believe that we now have something like 15 or 20 people who are focused on that corporate proposition. So the model really is about trying to bring local expertise into the different regions, and the people working in those teams have strong relationships with the banks that are active in those locations. They understand some of the local challenges and market practices, and in that way we're trying to kind of face off into the market. What we're also doing is we're organizing a whole series of events. So those events are typically on a regional basis. So for example, next month in April here in London, we're organizing what we're calling a SWIFT Business Forum. And the idea of these sorts of events is to bring the different players from the community together, banks, corporates, other types of financial institutions.
Now, if we move to look at the latest initiatives for corporates, you're starting to do some really quite serious new innovations. We're going to look at it in three areas: the swift onboarding, the simplifying the corporate model, and then extending the portfolio of offerings. Starting with easier swift onboarding, I thought it was pretty easy now anyway.
One is we've looked at all of the processes that we have in terms of membership, the documentation that corporates need, corporates and other types of institutions need to provide. And I suppose what we've been doing is just trying to bring efficiency into the process so that it reduce the amount of form filling that.
Oh, good.
So it's nothing more than, I guess, trying to make it a simpler, more enjoyable sort of end customer experience.
And does that include simplifying the SWIFT model for corporates? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I suppose what we're trying to do there is, what is the SWIFT for corporates model? It's broadly allowing corporates to connect to their multiple banks in a standardized way, typically for sending out payment instructions and receiving statements and other intraday reporting. But one of the nuances of this is that corporates are obliged to work within a closed user group. And you may have heard the term SCORE mentioned in the past.
Yep. So,
while there are something like 10 or 11,000 entities on the SWIFT network, and I believe there's something like 8,000 banks that are connected onto SWIFT. If you look at the number of banks that support the SCORE model, this corporate's closed user group, it's actually closer to around 1,800. Now, those 1,800 tend to be the banks that are most active in the corporate space. They're the ones that position themselves for treasury and cash management services. These are the big corporate banks. But for example, one of the initiatives that we've done recently is to remove the requirement for bank branches to be registered into SCORE just to provide statement information. So for example, if you have a corporate that is working with a variety of banks, including many local banks in some exotic countries around the world. In the past, in order for those banks to have been able to send a statement to the corporate, they would have first had to join SCORE if they weren't in there already. But now, as of December last year, we removed that restriction. So now, any bank anywhere in the world, regardless of whether they're part of the SCORE closed user group, is now able to send statement information, MT940s, MT942s, etc., to their corporates. So,
are you also going to get rid of the difficulty of putting in private companies? They have to be registered in a formal stock exchange somewhere. Is that ever going to be removed?
Again, these are all examples of areas that we're looking at to make it simpler for corporates to join.
So the answer is no.
At the moment, just to be very clear on that point, any corporate can join SWIFT. You don't have to be registered on the stock exchange. In fact, more and more we're seeing privately held companies. The idea of the stock exchange listing was actually meant with the best of intentions. It was to preserve the integrity of SWIFT, and typically a stock exchange listing comes with a requirement on the part of the corporate to be open, disclosure of information, etc., etc. All of the things that go with a stock exchange listing. So that was the rationale behind that requirement. But in fact, any privately held company, one that is not listed on the stock exchange, can also join as long as one of their banks sponsors them into the model. And in fact, that's an increasingly popular model. There are very many large corporates that have exactly the right profile to be on SWIFT, but they're privately held. Examples are IKEA, Virgin Atlantic, Saudi Aramco. You can see these are very large, very well-known geographically very large, with geographically very large footprints, exactly the right kind of profile to be on Swift, but they happen to be privately held.
Yeah, agreed. But you haven't mentioned where the new Swift consulting support sits within this framework for corporates.
Well, again, this is all part of the idea behind trying to make it easier for corporates to join Swift. So typically what we see is corporates will have their back office systems, very often a treasury management system. They may have one or more ERP systems. They may have other payment hubs. They may have matching systems, reconciliation systems. And then when coming onto Swift, they need to integrate the Swift platform into those back office systems. And then they also need to make sure that they have the right kind of level of communication at a messaging level with the different...
And that's where you provide consulting support.
Absolutely. So what we're doing is we're increasingly getting involved in the wider project that a corporate might have to integrate Swift into their back office. We're helping the corporates with the onboarding of the different banks. We're getting involved in the testing of end-to-end message flows and that sort of thing. So yes, whereas in the past we perhaps provided the interfaces themselves and left the actual project either to the corporate or maybe to a third-party provider, increasingly who has the expertise around the Swift standards, who's been involved in delivering this kind of solution into the market now for more than 10 years. It's Swift. We have all of the expertise, and it makes sense that we increasingly position ourselves to provide those services where it's appropriate.
Extending the portfolio of offerings, what are the new products that are particular for corporates that they need to be thinking about, need to be looking at?
Yeah, so when you look at Swift for corporates, it's probably fair to say that most people, myself included, if I'm honest, sort of focus mainly on the aspect of Swift providing secure financial connectivity on a multi-bank basis, this ability to connect through one gateway, one network into multiple banks. But actually, more and more, we're offering a range of products and services that, as part of a wider portfolio. So, for example, we're getting involved more on the sort of automation and compliance side. We're getting involved in digital identity and mandate management. We're going beyond the traditional payments and cash management that we're known for and looking more at the trade and supply chain work. So, if we look at some of those areas, on the connectivity front, well, I mentioned already that we're cognizant of the fact that the typical corporate joining today is going to have much lower volumes than the large banks that we were connecting 10, 20, 30 years ago. But in terms of the connectivity solutions that the market needs today, they need to be lighter, they need to, from a technology footprint point of view, they need to be more plug and play, they need to come at a price point that is more applicable to the volume of traffic that they're likely to be sending and receiving. And that's where we're continuing to build on our cloud-based offerings. So you may be familiar with Alliance Light 2, the cloud-based Swift interface solution that we have. But we also are developing a range of complementary cloud-based solutions around that. So, for example, we're now offering a Swift integration lane that is designed to kind of make it simpler for corporates to do any mapping and enrichment and translation of file and payment formats to support their different banking.
Where would a corporate go to learn more about these additional services?
The place to start would be just by contacting Swift. So the Swift website is, the main website is www.swift.com, but we have a microsite, swift.com/corporates, And we also have a microsite, swift.com/alliance-like too. So these are good websites to try.
Well, thank you, Neil. That was most interesting. And you can see the progress of Swift and how Swift is becoming more and more central to the day-to-day life and efficiencies inside the Corporate Treasury Department. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome.